Hi, shall we make a start? Hi everyone, thanks for joining us for this webinar. This is the first webinar that the Academic Circle on the Right to Development, which is a group of academics supporting the mandate of the United Nations Special Rapporteur on the Right to Development, Professor Surya Deva. We're organising as part of a series on development dialogues that is also organised under the auspices of the Right to Development mandate. My name is Celine Tan. I'm Professor of International Economic Law, and I'm one of the co-chairs of the Right to Development Academic Circle. And with me here is my colleague and co-chair, Professor Daniel Bradlaugh from the University of Pretoria. And we have a wonderful panel today to discuss and launch a very important book, Feminism in Public Debt, a Human Rights Approach. And I'll leave that to Danny and the rest of the panel to give you more details, but I also want to thank Bristol University Press, and in particular, the Bristol University Press series, Business, Finance and International Development. And with us is one of the editors of that series, Dr. Paul Gilbert from the University of Sussex. Thank you very much, Paul, for co-organising this. And I'm actually, just to declare conflict of interest or whatever, also one of the advisory board of the series. Thank you all. And Danny, take it away.
Great. Thanks, Celine, and hello to everyone. As Celine said, I'm Danny Bradlaugh. I'm a professor at the University of Pretoria and a co-chair of the Academic Circle. And this is a great first event for us. And I think this is a very appropriate book to do as our first event, because the topic today, feminism in public debt, is really about a crisis that at this point we should call a silent crisis. That it's not systemic in the sense that it's countries that could really systemically affect the whole financial system, but it's a crisis in which there are 48 low-income countries which are home to over 3 billion people who're being forced to spend more money on debt service than on health and education. There's a promise that more money should be made available. So, for example, as many of you will know, the multilateral development banks are on an evolution to become bigger, better, and more effective. And even though they're increasing their spending, they're certainly not increasing it as much as was promised and was suggested in the independent expert group of the G20, which called for a tripling of their money. At the same time, official bilateral aid is not going up, and much of it is being reallocated to Ukraine to deal with the migration crisis in Europe. So there's much less money available than there used to be. Many of these countries don't have access to financial markets, and if they do, it's at exorbitant rates that are not really affordable to them. So it really is a very serious crisis. And the crisis effectively means that there's hardships, that the money that should be being spent on health, education, social welfare is just not available. And we're really talking about a development crisis more than a debt crisis as a result of this. So that having a book that looks at this and takes a particular perspective on this is an important development and something that's really we should interrogate more. We want this session to be as interactive as possible. So we're not going to structure it as a series of presentations, but as a series of questions and answers. And one of the things that strikes me about the book is the right to development is a holistic right that covers all the rights, really, of human rights. This book is taking a particular perspective of looking at the problem through the lens of impact on women and on feminism. And I think that we should focus on that aspect of this in talking about this. We have a wonderful panel today that I'm going to introduce, and then I'll ask each of them a question to begin with. But first is Juan Pablo Bohuslavsky, who's a senior researcher at Argentina's National Scientific and Technical Research Council. He's a former UN independent expert on debt and human rights and a debt officer at the UNCTAD Division of Debt and Development, and focuses on human rights and debt issues. Second speaker, and most importantly for this panel, is that Juan Pablo is one of the co-editors of this book, as well as a contributor to a number of the chapters in the book. We're also lucky to have one of the other contributors to the book, Dr. Marina Zucker Marquez, who's a senior academic researcher at Boston University's Global Development Center, where she focuses on sovereign debt and financial stability. She previously also worked at UNCTAD in the Debt and Development Office and has a PhD in I think, economics from Freie Universität in Berlin. Our third speaker is Johanna Cortez Nieto, who's an associate professor at the School of Law at Rosario University in Bogota, Colombia, and also an expert for the Working Group on the Protocol of San Salvador for the Organization of American States. Her research focuses on critical perspectives on law and development. Our fourth speaker is Professor Elissa van Weyenberger, who's a professor in development economics and is currently the Dean of the College of Development Economics and Finance at SOAS University of London. She has a long-standing interest in the IFIs and how they shape policy space in developing countries, and has been looking at private finance in public service provision in developing countries. So as I said, I'm going to start with a question for each of them, and beginning with Juan Pablo as the co-editor of the series, of this book, and as a contributor, that say, why did you decide there was a gap in the literature that this book could fill? And what were the benefits that, as you saw it, from looking at it specifically from a feminist perspective, as opposed to sort of a more holistic perspective?
Mm-hmm. Can you hear me well?
We can hear you.
Great. Good morning from Argentina. Yeah, but first of all, I thank you, Danny, Celine, and also Paul, for putting this panel together, and also Surya for inviting me to be part of the academic circle of the mandate. And it's also a pleasure to be part of this discussion with Marina, Elissa, and Johanna. As we know, there is a vast literature around debt issues on the one hand, and on the other hand, there is a critical mass of literature on gender inequality. Yet, there are not many studies integrating both sets of challenges. I mean, interlinking debt and women's human rights. And this is what we tried to do in the book, which, by the way, was a truly collective and interdisciplinary endeavor. So this collective work broadens and strengthens the feminist approach to the challenges posed by the aggravated or differentiated effects of sovereign over-indebtedness and economic policies often associated with debt policies. Hence, the book poses a wide range of questions about the relationship between debt and economic violence, development, climate change, legal standards, United Nations conferences on women, international financial institutions' approach to debt and gender issues, such as the so-called gender strategy of the IMF, adjustment policies, the right to care and education, also private debt, budget analysis, and debt and life sustainability, social progress indicators, the need for reforms in the international financial architectures from a gender perspective, gender bonds, and also the institutionalization of a serious, robust feminist agenda in public debt management. All these questions are posed from a feminist perspective. In a nutshell, Dani, I think that one of the benefits of this approach is of epistemic nature, in the sense that we try to make the point that in an interdisciplinary and holistic approach to debt issues is fundamental if we want to address gender gaps effectively. It is at the same time about elaborating on how we can go deeper and how debt sustainability is assessed in order to grasp the roots of inequalities that at the end of the day should be translated into debt policies from a feminist perspective. Thank you.
Great, thanks. One of the things, as you said, this is a multidisciplinary project, and Juan Pablo is a lawyer. Marina, you're an economist, and your chapter has a lot of data on the impact of the debt crisis. Can you briefly explain how the debt crisis has affected women? I mean, I know you've got a lot of detail in the chapter, so I know you're not asking you to summarize it all. But why did you find it useful to disaggregate this to look specifically at the impact on women?
Thank you, Dani. It's a pleasure to be here in the discussion, bringing some of the insights that from the chapter that I wrote with my colleague Penelope Hawkins, which is the chief of the Debt and Development Finance brand at UNCTAD. I will start actually answering your second question first. And I think, so why is it relevant to actually disaggregate the impact of women in particular when we look to the debt crisis, debt vulnerabilities? We argue in our chapter is that this is because women often are responsible to particular roles in our society. We know that it's connected to social norms. They have particular needs. They are the ones in, that bear child, so they need, some special needs during their lifespan. They also face particular discrimination compared to men. In our chapter, we highlighted 3 dimensions of women, which, is not the unique 3 dimensions, but they are the ones that we try to, that we saw commonality among countries and cases. This is women as citizens, women as caregivers, and women as employees. We know the first one, women as citizens, try to show how women, the needed in access to healthcare, education, pension, and how it's different related to men. The second one, women as caregivers, is related to women as, in household with one unpaid household, how they are, time poor because they are the ones providing childcare, elderly care, so on and so forth. The third is like women as employee, how women are particularly employed by the public sector because they are mostly focused on health and education sectors. So looking to this, 3 categories, we try to show how throughout, the cycle of debt. We know here I'm going to focus particularly when, we have a debt crisis and the public sector cut expenditures and how, it affects women. But in our chapter, we show that this is true during the debt crisis, and this is true also during the accumulation crisis, because the accumulation period, throughout the period when the governments contract more debt, usually what happens is that, and we show data, for instance, for the least developing countries, when the country start to increase the liabilities, they start to pay more on that service than, for instance, on health. So in 2010, for instance, the LDCs, they were paying 100% of they pay on health expenditure was the same amount for that service. And 10 years later, this was 250%. So we show that, usually the governments give priority to that service. This is true during the crisis, and this is true during the accumulation phase. What I would like to give, 3 specific examples with some data that we collected, especially women as citizens, as caregivers, and as workers. So women as citizens, right? So an example that we give in our book is how the lack of health expenditure, or the cut of health expenditure, actually especially affect women during their lifetime. So For instance, we know that in low and middle income countries, 94% of maternity deaths occur in low and middle income countries. And this is very connected to the lack of universal healthcare. And we know that's, one of the reasons that is lack of healthcare is because the governments are not giving priority to the universal access to health. Instead, they're, focused on paying that service throughout the period. When we know that when some governments, they try to, instead of doing public health expenditure, some of them, especially during the crisis period, they try to do user pay systems where women, instead of having a public service that they deserve, they need to incur sometimes in personal debt to have access to the health needs that they have. So for instance, we know some of the data that we collected, we have shown that although in low middle income countries, in low income countries, although men is often more financially integrated, when they have often more access to contract debt, women are the ones that contract more debt related to health needs. So it shows that the health burden, if the government doesn't provide, the health burden is going to be in the shoulders of the women more than in the men. So this is one example when we say women as citizens. When we look to women as caregivers, we know that because women are often the ones in the household providing, cooking and fetching water, taking care of the children, women are often time poor, and they have less ability to, go to the labor market. So we found that for all income groups, there is at least a 15% gap between men and women in the access to the labor market. Of course, access to the labor market is very complex. There are a lot of factors, but for sure, one of the key ones is how women are time poor and they cannot, have the same ability to work in the market as men do. And also, the lack of public infrastructure. So we know today there is almost 100 billion people that don't have access to electricity. And if women have access to electricity in their house, for instance, if the government extend access to this kind of public service, they are going, the time in the household is going to decline because, they don't need to spend so much time in household chores. So this is one point. The third one, and I will stop here, is women as workers. So we know that women, the key employer of women is the government. This is why is it? Because government expenditure is a lot of focus on health and education, and women are often, 70% of women. These sectors employ 70% women. This is quite opposite from, for instance, construction sectors where they employ only like 5 or 10% of women in these sectors. So the sectors that the government spend a lot, which is health and education, women are the main employees. So when the government doesn't expend as much as they should in health and education, or when they cut during the crisis period, women are the ones that lose their jobs. And in many cases, in many families, they are the key providers, so child also are affected. So this one is one example that we show, how these channels, what are these channels that we see when a crisis hit, when there is, a priority to, invest, spending on that services instead of public expenditure, how women are especially affected. So these are some of the data we have showed. Just quickly, I think one aspect that we have emphasized is that how this is part of a logic in the problem of international financial architecture. So the key to change this is to have, for instance, a reform in the debt sustainability analysis, having more patient capital, more cheaper capital, more productive capital in developing countries. Having more aid, more trade to developing countries. When we have an international financial architecture that is pro for development, women are going to benefit more. So we'll stop here. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Marina. So Johanna and Elisa, I think Marina and Juan Pablo have done have laid out how much can be learned by using a feminist lens at looking at the issue, which leads, and two questions. Do you agree with them that it does add a useful perspective? And what's gained and what's lost by using a feminist perspective in terms of understanding debt? Is there anything lost? Is it even an opportunity cost, maybe? And you both come from different disciplines and different parts of the world. So I look, taking it from your perspective, and let's do it in alphabetical order. So we'll start with Elissa and then come to Joanna.
Thank you very much, Danny. And first of all, let me thank the editors of the book of having brought this very important resource amidst all of us. And I think it's going to be a key resource, crucial, as we navigate, as what you refer to, Danny, as the silent debt crisis that we're facing. So in short, I'm going to argue that there are no opportunity costs attached to having a feminist lens, but let me do that in a bit longer fashion. So I'll argue in a set of points. So I think that first, and I think Juan Pablo has already referred to that, I think deploying a feminist lens gives us clarity in terms of what should be in scope when we examine the impact of debt. And the book does this by deploying an interdisciplinary approach, which I think, and which Juan Pablo has already emphasized, is imperative, not just for meaningful analysis of the impact of debt on women, but also for us to understand what successful policy interventions could be in the service of perhaps a broader transformative development project. So not just limited in terms of the impact of women. So I think that the combination of a rights-based approach that emerges from the legal discipline with a political economy approach is instructive, because the political economy approach allows us to engage with the structural limits of some of the existing gender-focused initiatives. And I think what the book does quite nicely is to tease that out explicitly with a focus on the IMF that's been engaged in the gender space since 2013, but where we can easily see the limits of that. So I think that combining or seeing the human rights framework as a transformative tool of the economy, where it becomes a method to address the complex objectives of political economy, if you want, of us being committed to declining poverty, declining inequality, etc. Now, the political economy approach itself then benefits from the deployment of a feminist, or if you want, a social reproduction lens, as it draws attention to the multiple dimensions of gender inequalities. And Marina has already highlighted these. Women are workers, they are caregivers, they are consumers, they are debtors, they are citizens, etc. But I think that in a political economy approach, the feminist lens further allows to highlight or surface how women easily act as what could be called shock absorbers of last resort in crisis moments, and including those that are related to issues of debt. So when we have shocks, as in changes in interest rates globally, changes in market access for countries, changes in the demand for exports of particular countries, changes in the prices of imports that particular countries face, all with effect on debt positions of countries, we see that the reactions to these particular shocks have disproportionately negative effects on women. So I think, again, is there an opportunity cost associated with that lens? I would argue strongly no, because the women would be likely to be disproportionately affected. And again, I think what's nice in the book is that it really highlights how we see then this reality of women being shock absorbers of last resorts, implying the failure of countries to fulfill their obligations as guarantors of key economic and social rights. So I think that the interdisciplinarity of the book that brings together different types of feminist, political economy, legal approaches does a great job in making us aware of the need to connect individual, social, economic rights with collective rights, which, as you already put in your opening remarks, include the right to development, for which a feminist political economy approach is key. And the reason why I think it's key is that if we're thinking through what is the collective right to development, we need to understand the kind of material base, as in the kind of economy that needs to be fostered for these rights to be realized. And we need an appreciation of how the asymmetric integration of particular countries in global circuits of finance, production, and trade fundamentally affect women's rights. So I think, to close, addressing the deep-seated structural roots of economic inequalities, including those that affect women, necessitates us to rethink, if you want, wholesale economic policy paradigms, putting feminist imperatives at the center. So we need a feminist lens as we rethink macroeconomic policy, as we rethink industrial policy, as we rethink social policy. All this in support of a truly transformative development strategy that would allow a collective right to development to be meaningful. So I don't think there are opportunity costs attached to by elevating a feminist lens on public debt.
No, great, thank you. I mean, you made a number of really important points in that. Johanna, just before I pass on to you, I just want to remind people in the audience, please begin thinking. If you have any questions, please put them in the Q&A box and we'll integrate them into the discussion as we go forward. But Johanna, over to you.
Thank you, Danny, and thank you, Selena and Paul, for organizing this book launch. And I also want to say thank you to the editors and the contributors. I think it's a wonderful book and it makes a great contribution to discussions about public finance and debt and feminism. So my first comment is that I teach public finance law in Colombia, and I find the kind of the materials in the book really, really helpful to help or to highlight thinking about my students, the connections between public finance law, which tends to be like usually thought as a very technical, dry and abstract legislation or piece of legislation. So it is really important to have these sort of materials to show the connections between this very technical pieces of law and the problems of distribution, and also the connections with climate justice and the root causes, as you have been mentioning, of inequality across the globe. So I just wanted to say that this is really helpful, and it's also in Spanish, which is great because sometimes there are these gaps about like knowledge production. So sometimes for my students, it's really, really difficult to have access to this kind of conversation. So I also thank you for publishing the book in both languages. I think that's really, really helpful. So in terms of what we gain and opportunity cost, I think I agree with Elisa that I don't see any opportunity costs or losses here. Actually, I think there is a lot of contributions from the feminist perspective on public debt. I just would like to highlight that, for instance, this connection between global political economy and everyday life is a really important contribution because, and I think feminist work, like feminist approaches recently have placed a lot of attention to the everyday. And that's really, really important because without that, it is very difficult to understand, for instance, how debt travels from the IMF or governments to households. And it's also very difficult without this perspective on the everyday life to understand suffering, the kind of suffering that debt produces among different groups of communities and groups of the population. So I think also it helps us to understand, for instance, the connection between debt and not only public labor and women in public work, but also informal labor. Actually, in the context of the well, oh, sorry, I forgot the name. I forgot the name. Sorry, the collective we have on international economic law. A couple of years ago, we produced some reports on informal labor during the pandemic. And it was really, really interesting to see the connection between austerity, how that was discussed at the time, and the increasing informal labor levels, at least in Colombia and other parts of Latin America. So this understanding of, or the focus on everyday life really help us to understand why women are not just, cut from public jobs, but also engaging in informal labor, as this is the only way they can, in a way, harmonize care, responsibilities, and produce some income for their families. And so that work on the everyday, I think, is a really, really important methodological contribution of feminist studies to these issues. So that's one of the things. And the other thing I think is important is connected to what Elisa was saying about how feminist political economy enables us to see the structures and longer patterns across different countries and also different sectors of society. And I think in the case of, actually some chapters of the book are really interesting in this regard, because they connect issues of debt, inequality, and, for instance, climate justice and the problems of neo-extractivism in the region. So that ability to place problems in context and connect different issues of injustice is something that I think is also a contribution of feminist approaches to this kind of discussion. So I will close there.
Great, thanks, Johanna. I just want to alert everyone that Paul has put in the chat box a link to the IEL, the International Economic Law Collective project that Johanna was mentioning. I also want to highlight.
Sorry, I forgot the name, the International Law Collective, and I think, thank you so much. Sorry for that.
But I also want to highlight the fact that you pointed out that the book's in Spanish as well as English, because I think the language issue is a really important issue, of that knowledge shouldn't only be in dominant languages. I mean, obviously every book's not going to be in every language, but it's really important to note when it is being published in multiple languages. I mean, I feel part of my job is to not only highlight how good this book is, but also to kind of push us to be more critical and to think deeper about this. And when I was raising the opportunity cost, in a sense, I was saying, if you adopt a feminist lens, what is the difference if you adopt just say a general human rights approach rather than a feminist approach, or if you adopted an approach of looking at it from other sorts of social groupings, from class or indigenous people or some other group? Because I'm assuming two things, and I'm combining two questions here, and then I'll open it up for everyone to take you choose which one is. One is that there's a limit to how many approaches you can, in terms of policy making, how many approaches can actually be studied in advance of making policy. And if you're doing a gender impact assessment, does that mean that it becomes harder to do as an environmental and social impact assessment or a human rights impact assessment? And does that matter? Is one question. The other question is, we've sort of implicitly said that women are a homogeneous category and that all women are going to be affected equally by whatever policies are adopted or whatever debt issues arise. But clearly different categories or different classes of women are going to be affected differently. And do we have to disaggregate in some way in order to thinking about this? Because in some issues, I mean, you can see there would be winners and losers within particular feminist women's groups as well. So just to put both of those out and invite all of you to comment. And Celine and Paul, you should also feel free to jump in if you would like on these questions. who would like to go first? Marina, your smile suggests you wanted to go first. So go for it.
Well, I wonder if that is actually, looking to the feminist point of view. I think it's, it's a subset, it's a complementary, I think, view from the human rights. I think you're putting very tricky and difficult questions to answer, Danny, but I will try to explain a little bit how I see it. Of course, we could have as many, grouping that we can, but I think the feminist lens is quite, broad in the sense that, as Elisa mentioned, women, I think this is in any group, I will say, with certain, or, with some kind of with confidence, and women in any specific group or society, they are the shock observers of last resort, as she said. So I think giving feminist lens is actually looking within the human rights approach, which is the group that is, being more impacted, and what are, the key, and from this you can see what are the key policy approach that we should have. I think one contribution of this book, as as a whole, as other authors emphasize this, is that sometimes looking to specific, very narrow groups can have some value added, but also, when we look to, compensatory or very specific approaches, you also means that, macroeconomic decisions, affect all the groups. So I think a way is that, what I think an attempt that this book made is that to actually give a step back and see how macro policies actually can affect a large group. So I stop here so to give the chance for the next one. Thank you.
Great. Anyone else want?
Yeah.
Juan Pablo, go for it.
Oh, sorry, Elisa, you were first. Sorry. Oh, okay. Thank you. This is a very good question, Danny. I guess there are two sub questions that we need to deal with. One is, I mean, in order to to answer to your question on to what extent a human rights approach includes the feminist questions as well. So one question is whether human rights law is transformative enough to embrace feminism. And the other question is whether feminist demands are part of human rights law. And I think the answer is yes. So therefore, when we speak about the human rights approach, includes claims and rights related to indigenous people, to children, to person with disability, and also it's about discrimination against women. So, and this is a fundamental political and civil right. So there's no doubt that when we talk about gender issues, we are talking about human rights, international human rights law. And this is the approach that we adopted with the guiding principles on economic reforms and or the assessment of the human rights effects or impact of economic reforms that were adopted by the Human Rights Council in 2019. I mean, there is no contradiction. I mean, the feminist demands are part of international human rights law, and in my view, human rights law is well equipped in order to transform the society to make it equal, truly equal.
Great. Elisa, you were next.
Thank you. I wasn't putting my hand up, and I'm still trying to reflect I think there is a tension in terms of the human rights lens or the legal framing of this, and because as you put it, Danny, you're asking, are there trade-offs between different types of impact assessments, human rights, gender, environment, and perhaps because I am not coming at it from that kind of discipline, for me, there are not necessarily these tensions in terms of how we think through how we analyze the inadequacies of current, if you want, mainstream policy propositions, as well as how we think through the opportunities for a transformative project, where we can think with lenses that include feminist imperatives, with lenses that include ecological imperatives. So it's not necessarily that these are trade-offs. It's more about surfacing the need not to trade off in our analysis or in our ambition repercussions for some groups as compared to others. So it's to put that at the forefront as we're thinking through what do particular policy frameworks imply. How do we allow for the realities of the multiple positions, for instance, that women occupy by deploying a social reproduction lens on it, etc. So it's not, I'm not sure that it's a matter of trade-off as much as a matter of being sufficiently comprehensive in how we understand the constraints and the opportunities. Now, on your second question, of course, and I think that's very important, women are not a homogeneous group. We have multiple intersections. We have intersections with race, we have intersections with age, we have intersections with geographical locality, etc. And those need to be mobilized when necessary as we're thinking through specific issues at different kind of, I don't know, scales of a particular problem. I think if we're thinking in general around that sustainability or impact of debt on women, and we're talking in the general terms of the implications of contractionary fiscal policy on education, health, we know that to a certain extent we can make general statements, as Marina has already highlighted, and as the book documents again, of how this is going to disproportionately affect women, sometimes catastrophically, as we see increases in maternal mortality, etc. So I think at certain levels, we can fall back on the general category. In different, in other types of analysis, we may need something, again, tools that are more sophisticated to tease out the intersections across different characteristics. That would be my proposition.
Great, thank you. Joanna, did you want to add anything?
Yeah, I agree with Juan Pablo that human rights approaches provided like a very similar lenses and to feminist approaches, but I do think there are a couple of things that feminist approaches might complement or add to human rights approaches when we talk about public debt and other fiscal policy in general. And I think one is the one that I mentioned in my previous comment is this attention to the everyday life, because and how we can complement quantitative and qualitative analysis. I think without qualitative analysis in terms of everyday women experiences of fiscal policy and debt, it will be very difficult to see, for instance, how is it that women are becoming, as highlighted in some chapters of the book, like the new financial subject that most private financial institutions are targeting, and how private debt is increasing and the effect that it has on women's everyday life. So I think that combination of quantitative and qualitative and this attention to the everyday is an important contribution of feminist approaches. And it also, for instance, helps us to understand how labor has changed because of fiscal policies, and as in this study I was mentioning, why women are becoming or are engaging increasingly in informal labor. And this is not because they find it like flexible. I mean, there is of course some agency to this, but it's also because they cannot find or harmonize productive and reproductive work in other ways. So how we at the end deal with this is like bringing productive work to their households. So in the same space, which is a private space, they are doing both things, generating some kind of income, but also dealing with their care responsibilities, and how it is also restructuring, for instance, relationships in popular neighborhoods. So I think that kind of effects can only be gathered or seen through this kind of qualitative analysis. So I think that's one contribution. And the other contribution is, I think, how feminist approaches also bring like other kind of distributing questions. I'm thinking about feminist methodologies and how they pay attention to distributive analysis. I know political economy also does this, but I think there are also other questions that feminist approaches bring. For instance, the question about the women and how they are placed and what they lose every time fiscal policies change, or this kind of questions. So I think those two are important contributions that feminist approaches can make to this kind of questions. And regarding the second question about how we deal with different groups of women, I think it is important to, besides thinking, this question is more based on how gender assessments are conducted here in Colombia, usually in like internal budget assessments for a feminist or a gender perspective, focus on the number of women that can benefit from different lines in budgets. So we need to think what can, beyond how many women are benefiting, like who are these women? And for that, we need like other kind of indicators, for instance, indicators about informal labor. Because if we pay attention to how informal labor is changing across different time, we can understand that it's something that's happening in terms of the relationship between fiscal policy and women's choices regarding job and care responsibilities. So I will stop there, but I think there are a couple of ideas that I wanted to share.
Great. Celine, Paul, did you want to add anything? Oh, otherwise, there's a question in the Q&A. I think it's the fate of a good book, good academic book, that you end up being pushed to answer new questions that you hadn't thought about, but which is a sign of that you've got people thinking and you're challenging people to think more. And Daniel Tamsanka Moyo has a question for you that I'm going to read the question and then open it up, but I think it's probably more, it starts off to Juan Pablo, but then we can open it up. It says, low and middle income countries continue to default in settling their debt obligations, and this increases arrears and penalties, ultimately entrenching these countries into debt distress. With this as the reality, does the book provide recommendations on the innovative strategies of policy of addressing debt distress, especially in Africa, where women and girls are largely hit by poverty and climate change? And I think just to add to that question is what are there policy recommendations that come out of the book that you would give to government officials in Africa or in Latin America or in other parts of the world? Anywhere in the world, really, not even debt-distressed countries, but countries that are just trying to be more gender responsible. And we'll start with you, Juan Pablo, because I think as the editor, you're the first person to respond.
Sure, thank you, Danny, for the question. Well, one of the recommendations, I would say the main recommendation, it provides arguments. Legal, developmental, economic arguments for an obligation of all kinds of creditors, multilateral creditors, bilateral creditors, private creditors, for granting debt relief when needed, which has to be proportional to the fiscal space needed by debtor states in order to ensure the realization of the principle of non-discrimination against women, so that this is a reality. So this is the kind of the main argument, the one pillar, the obligation for granting debt relief. And the second I mean, it's more than recommendation. It basically systematizes, crystallizes what it exists already in international human rights law, is the obligation to conduct participatory, transparent, clear, independent human rights impact assessment, including feminist evaluation of economic policies, including debt policies. I can elaborate more on the specific approach of the book in order to conduct effective human rights feminist impact assessment, but I'm sure Marina wants also to jump in and share what they propose in their chapter.
Thank you, Juan Pablo. I can jump in that question too. So under the umbrella that Juan Pablo just mentioned on debt restructuring, one particular recommendation that our chapter did was the reform of the debt sustainability. So for those that are not familiar with the discussion on debt sustainability, this is an analysis mostly, conducted by the IMF and the World Bank when a country, are marching to that distress and they need to restructure. This is a tool that assesses, if the country are in that distress, if they need restructure, and if they do, how much they need, very broadly, very broadly saying. The problem is that this tool is very narrowly conceived in the terms of what obligations, social, human rights, feminist obligations, they include in the analysis. So we could say that this debt sustainability as it is today, it includes some obligations in the analysis, like to the debtors, to pay the debtors, but they do not include the public investments in child care and healthcare, preserving investments through public investment throughout the world. So I think a key recommendations is to reform the sustainability analysis. The UNCTAD has been doing some research on that. They have developed a tool that incorporates the SDFA, which incorporates some of the SDGs investments in their model. So this is something that is feasible. We could incorporate this these social contracts that the government has in the debt sustainability, and this would give us, the obvious conclusion is that the country will need more debt relief to actually fulfill their obligation. And I think beyond this, I think we need to accept a larger role of the government in the economy. I think governments, they especially, and low-income countries that are low and middle-income countries where governments are key, to boost economic development, where the private sector is not as present. Not saying that in high-income countries is, the role of government is not important, but I think especially in countries in developing, the role of government is key in many aspects. So I think we need to accept more that the government needs to be, providing childcare, public health, and this is going, as I said before, basic infrastructure, and I think these are going to be, accepting that the government has to play a larger role, and then we need to have more space for government expenditure in the budgets, in the debt sustainability. It's key. And yeah, so I will focus on the debt sustainability for this answer.
Great. Elissa, go for it.
Actually, can I ask a question? Is that allowed?
Absolutely.
Thank you. So it's to Juan Pablo and perhaps also to Marina, in particular on the back of this intervention, which I think was very useful. So we are aware that there is going to be, that the IMF and the World Bank are initiating a review of the debt sustainability framework for low-income countries. And your book is super timely. It's really emphasizing the various important lacuna, if you want, across that sustainability analysis. So I was wondering, do you have plans in terms of influence? I know that it's not just a matter of putting ideas out there, that they will be taken into account, but are you hoping to target some of those conversations, or is there a role for the academic circle in that context? So it's a question both to Juan Pablo, Marina, but also maybe to Celine, whether there is thought as to where there can be kind of directed interventions, given that there are particular developments, not just in this particular space, but we're going to have FFD4, South Africa is assuming the G20 presidency, etc., etc.
Well, let's start with on this book. So with Juan Pablo and Marina, and then we'll come to Celine and me can add in responding to that question.
So Elisa, whether we plan to have any influence in the debates within the IMF? Well, we know that the IMF, or generally speaking, international financial institutions, instrumentalizes feminist agenda. I mean, this is what we have seen in the self-called gender strategy of the IMF. I think changing the criteria for DSA, it's a huge move. It will be a huge move, and it could only come up after a strong pressure from borrowers. And this can happen, in my view, only if borrowers coordinate efforts in order to demand, because, you know, if we change the criteria that we use to calculate, to assess debt sustainability analysis, the result will mean that probably that relief has to be granted. So there is a lot of at stake, and the only way to change is by putting a lot of pressure on the IMF through a concerted kind of debtors club or cartel or whatever we want to call it. I mean, kind of coordination that we don't see in practice. But anyway, it will be such a good move in terms of how the financial markets work in practice, and it goes well beyond technical discussion. It's mainly about who pays the financial losses in the event of a default.
Marina, did you want to add to that?
Very briefly. So we know the review of the DSA is going to, it's a process that will take 7 years. These institutions, they are having, recurring meetings with CSOs, with academic. I think that is a space to plug in and show some of the results of the book, some of the feminist point of view on this. I think we'll need, to come, as Juan Pablo said, there will need to come many voices highlighting this point for us to see some changes in that direction. But I think there may be space for this. I think two aspects that I think it's very important to push in this reform. First is to show that public investment, in health education should be incorporated in the debt sustainability analysis going forward. Today, the debt sustainability as it is very shy on, and the volume of investments that the government should have. So I think this is something to push forward. Another thing is how the debt sustainability see government expenditure as it is. They don't see any multiplier, so they don't recognize any economic benefit of government investments, which is, from economic point of view of the literature, we know that is. So I think there are some aspects that can push, and we could have a better debt sustainability analysis. But I think there is this discussion going on, and I think academics, CSOs need to have more voice on what specifically needs to be changed.
Celine, did you want to? Oh, no, sorry, Juan Pablo, you were about to say something.
May I just to
Go
add one information? I mean, to really being conscious about the brutality of the neoclassical thought that dominates the IMF. In the introduction to the book, we wrote, if anyone still has doubts about the instrumental nature of the IMF gender strategy, that person needs to know that in 2017, the IMF posted an article on its website written by male economists where they explain why it was worth investing in the health of women in Rwanda. And I quote, "Healthy women will probably work outside the houses, they will have more stamina and energy for physical jobs, and they will work more hours." So these are the kind of brains that we are interacting with.
Can I just jump in very quickly, Danny?
Yeah.
And I just don't want to take up space because there's another very interesting question in the Q&A which we would, love our panelists to answer. Just on the whole issue of the lens in which all the not just the DSAs are framed, but also the narratives around sort of sovereign debt, austerity, expenditure, fiscal policy, etc. I think what would be really helpful as well, and I think the conversations that we're having here, the interdisciplinary conversations are really key, and it's really congratulations on the book, because bringing together different disciplines on this particular issue is quite challenging, and it's quite insightful to have a collection that has these different views. And I just wondered if part of the process is also about capacity building, because some of these ideas are not new. They've been around for quite a while now, several decades, and it's infused more of like an academic debate. But perhaps it's an opportunity, I think, Elisa, now perhaps to do more capacity building and awareness raising about these key lenses in which we can see things a little bit differently. So I would say that in terms of certainly in the work that we do in the academic circle and beyond, we could perhaps think about doing that a little bit more of sort of like outreach and capacity building, at least around these narratives, to support the communities that want to push this forward within those spaces. So I think Marina and Juan Pablo said it is about people bringing in those voices within these global governance policy making spaces. But unless you know what the issues are, how you approach it, what's the data, what's the research to back up those positions, it's really often very difficult for even stakeholders to bring them in. So that would be my kind of intervention and contribution here, and hopefully we can kickstart a broader sort of platform conversation moving forward. But yeah, Danny, there is now 2 questions.
Yes, I just wanted to add something, because I have a slightly different perspective on the DSA and the IMF on this that I think is worth putting into this, which is that the IMF, because it's taking on these new issues, is sorry, I'm having a. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, I can't see anyone. So, but if you can, there we go. Because the IMF is taking on all these new issues in whatever form and in whatever imperfect a way it is, it's changing the way it's doing business. And because it's changing the way it's doing business, it's becoming much more, exercising much more discretion in the way it does things. And it's having to interact in a much broader way with non-state actors in its member states than it did before. And that means that it has to start changing, it has to have new operating policies and practices, and it has to start thinking about the way it does business in a very different way, which raises issues about what are the process and procedures for that, and how does it held accountable for that? And 2 things, one of which is somewhat shameless, but one of which is not, is that the IEO, the Independent Evaluation Office of the IMF, has just released a study on the mandate of the IMF and how it's changing, which is quite critical about the IMF and the way it's not dealing with this in an adequate way, which I would encourage people to read because it really does get at some of these issues. The more shameless part is, I was recently published with 2 co-authors, Rosa Lustra and Stefan Park, an article looking at the DSA and looking at these issues and saying how there are international norms and standards and laws that the IMF should be using in developing principled operational policies and procedures for which it can be held accountable. So just to put that on the table there for discussion. But as Celine said, there are a couple of questions. So Joanna, and I want to, if you've got something to say before I get to the questions, please let me know. Okay, then let me put the question on the table because it's an interesting question from Lena Lavinas, who says, thanks for this very insightful discussion. Here's my question. Since almost half of the developing countries' foreign debt has been contracted with private creditors in global financial markets, is there any chance that human rights and feminist issues can really be taken into consideration in debt restructuring? So broadening the discussion in an important way, because I mean, as she said, this is a lot of the debt of many countries. And I think all of us have in some way have thought about these issues, but Juan Pablo, as a former independent expert on foreign debt and human rights, let's start with you. Welcome to talk about the book or to sort of broaden it beyond that, and then we'll open it up for whoever would like to add things.
No, I already spoke a lot, so
okay.
Lisa, Johanna, Marina. So,
Johanna, you've been silent. Would you like to start us off?
My answer will be, I'm quite pessimistic about this topic. I think it's important to raise awareness and have this kind of conversations. And as Celine was saying, we need to also share this information with people working in the grass organizations. And there are all these discussions about fiscal justice, and I think we should join efforts with all those discussions and try to, as I said, raise awareness about this. But to be honest, I think it's really difficult because, as also Juan Pablo said, there is this mindset which is really, really difficult to change. So it's not also about the law and standards, is also like the how people imagine and think about this kind of questions. So I think that's why education is important, because it can change imaginaries and mindsets about how to think about debt and in general public finance, because I think there is a kind of logic which is shared in discussions about taxation, debt, spending, and other fiscal issues.
Great. Who would like to? Anyone else?
I can be the next one. So thank you, Lena. This is a very good question. I think my first reaction is to say that actually, bondholders, commercial creditors, they need to participate in that restructuring in a comparable way of, to how much they have charged. So we know that these creditors, they do charge a premium when they lend to developing countries to allegedly compensate for the risk of lending to these countries. But when these countries default, which actually is it's a small volume, when Bank of America, for instance, has estimated that is like about 2% of the bonds, external bonds that are defaulted. So it's actually a very small portion. But when they default, the commercial creditors, they often don't take the laws that we would expect them to bear. So I think the first point is that we need the participation of all creditors, including commercial creditors, in a fair, comparable way. So if you have charged more, if you have charged a premium for lending to these countries, you should have a higher loss because you already have been compensated for that. But we know that these commercial creditors, they are often, their goal is to have short-term returns. So I think we need to think about specific, tools to bring them to the negotiation table in a commercial way in periods of high interest rate and with creditors that want short-term returns. I think a more intelligent strategy is, for instance, ready bonds for some commercial, for some banking institutions, for bondholders, maybe buyback. I will hook this to, I'm broadening here the discussion, and I will pass this to Daniel because we've been writing together on some of these ideas. For instance, having a buyback mechanism where, you know, we have a buyer of last resort that can buy that distressed bonds at you know, very high discount, and relend to the creditor with high, you know, less interest rate could be a way out. But we need to do this in a principled way, and then, you know, have identified where should, you know, the principal ways should be focused. So I will pass this to him. Sorry, put you on the spot, Daniel, but I think it's a very good hook.
But we'll come back to that. We'll go to Alyssa. I can see you've got your hand up, so please.
No, it's very brief, and I think Marina has done a fantastic job because she's spoken to the particular detail of how some of these things can be resolved. But given that Juan Pablo didn't want to come in initially, I just want to draw attention to the introduction that him and his co-author wrote, and I think they make this quite interesting point in terms of, you know, we always fall back on the fact that agreements must be, you know, served, but we never have that as a counterpoint to respect for international human rights law. Now, I know that respect for international human rights law is quite of a tough order today, given the state of the world. So, but there is this issue around, as the editors again in their introduction say, you know, is there law that says that some expenditure is imperative, i.e. paying back debtors as compared to discretionary, or should we make imperative expenditure that protects the rights of women, and then the rights of the debtors should be discretionary? There is no such, you know, where are we at? So I think that there is the human rights, international human rights frameworks could potentially come to some sort of service as we order, as we create some order in whose rights should be prioritized in the context of that restructuring. But again, I say that, but I don't have any hope in the current juncture that that will necessarily happen.
Johanna, did you want to add anything?
No, I was thinking that sometimes we need also to, I don't know, like train like people in national governments to negotiate better agreements. I think usually, I mean, I talk about my experience like teaching internally finance law and working with lawyers who work for our national government, and sometimes they don't see this. I mean, for them, it's not easy to see the connection between deals they are negotiating with the World Bank or the IMF and what is happening on the streets. So I think to train them to, you know, like on the one hand to realize these connections, and on the other hand to think how a different national international law will be possible is important, because at the end they are the ones who are going to interact and engage in conversations with this institution. So I think there is also an important entry point in that when we think about who is negotiating. It's difficult, and for instance, in Latin America, some countries have been trying, for instance, to renegotiate bilateral investment agreements, which is, well, this is a different conversation, but at the end, there is also this kind of question about whether that kind of international economic law could be transformed or thought in a different way. And they haven't been very successful so far, but at least there is a conversation about, you know, why those agreements are creating a lot of injustice and inequalities in countries like the ones in Latin America. So I think maybe if we start there, there's also something we could do.
Great. I just want to say that Paul has been doing a fantastic job of putting links up in the chat for all the different papers that have been mentioned. including the one Marina also put it up, the blog that her and I and Kevin Gallagher did last week, I think, on buybacks. And also to save Paul having to look for that, there's a link in that, because it mentioned, we said a principled approach, and there's a link in that blog to an article I wrote about the principled approach, which has 8 principles about how to do debt in a more human rights responsible way. But I mean that we don't have any more questions at the moment, but Celine, did you want to add anything? Because one of the things I've been thinking about in this discussion, and also as I looked at the book, I mean, we're the academic circle on the right to development, is how does the right to development relate to this book and to a feminist lens? Is this part of the right to development, or is this an add-on to the right to development? Or how do we, as an academic circle, use this in a way to advance, if I can put it this way, and it's probably the worst way of putting it, but advance the right to development, to promote it and to make it a more effective right? Because in a sense, it's I mean, I don't know what but it's sort of the collection of all the other rights. So if we can promote the right to development well, then I think it promotes human rights in all its dimensions. And this book, in a way, challenges us to do that, because the discussion we've been having covers so many different things from so many different angles. It makes me think about how do we connect this to the right to development. I don't have a good answer to that, but that's why I'm going to give the question over to all of you. Go for it, Celine.
Yeah, I think one of the I suppose the issues relating to the right of development is that it implicitly it should be an inclusive right, and that includes, you know, a right that all communities can have to a safe, you know, and inclusive social and economic enabling environment to thrive and to pursue livelihoods, right? And I think that when we think about the issues that permeate across the globe, and even within the sort of global South and developing countries, the way that the right to development or the lack of the right realization of that right is manifested across the globe is very different. And I think what this book provides us is a way or a lens and the tools that we would have to be able to navigate those, for want of a better word, intersectionalities, which really is not just a case of, oh, I've got intersecting identities, but the way that perhaps different people with different identities and the compounding structural I suppose barriers that people from with different identities face, and the compounding nature of that overall, that sets them back from actually participating in the economy and social life in a way that is meaningful. And I think this allows for this, and it also feeds, it sort of, in a way, kind of resonates with the question you have asked earlier in the webinar, much earlier in the beginning, does this necessarily provide are we not homogenizing a group as well, right? Like when you talk about women, there are, women of different ethnicities, different class structures, different geographies, and different backgrounds. And I think that I felt in a way, perhaps that could, if I would offer a small-ish criticism perhaps of the book, which is excellent, so I don't want to, kind of flatten the achievements of the book, but certainly that if there was a gap, perhaps, that I would say is that maybe that aspect of that intersectionality may have been, like that is a small gap, and perhaps that could have been brought to the fore a little bit clearer in the way that, you know, some of the research that Joanna and her team did on informality. Actually, that project was really instructive in terms of looking at how, you know, the crisis, the pandemic, and the responses of the state to those crises actually had differentiating impacts on different classes of women actually within the society. So I think that's really useful to, I think I'm just going to leave it there in terms of understanding. So the right to development, I'm just saying, you know, like I think it should be an inclusive form, and this book goes a long way to presenting one aspect of it. But I think in terms of, you know, a racialized view of the economy, I think we you know, we've got that lens too. I think it's really important to bring that in because, yeah, I think that we can get caught up in one particular vision of what it means to have a right to development that, you know, necessarily then excludes more marginalized voices. Yeah.
So I'm just conscious of time, and we're coming to the end of our time. So what I think we should do, and Juan Pablo, I know I saw your hand up. What is give everyone an opportunity to answer the question and make a final comment, and to do this in the reverse order. So we end up with Juan Pablo, who can respond to whatever, to Celine's comment and to any other comments that come up in the course. So let's do it in reverse order. So we'll go with Joanna, we'll start with you.
Okay, sorry. No, just a final reflection. I think reading the book was also really helpful for me to understand, you know, there are different understandings of development. And certainly the hegemonic approach to debt, sovereign debt service, and fiscal policy are all, and we have been discussing about all the problems that this approach to development based on growth, based on extraction, which had led to intensified extractivism in my region in the last 3 decades, is there. And my question was, why, if we know that all these problems and this idea of development is been so problematic, why do we still reproduce this idea in international economic law and discussions about the services? And so my final reflection will be that this book is also helpful to see the new dimensions of the problems that we have been highlighting for decades, but it's also helpful in terms of thinking about how development in a different way should look like.
Great, thanks. Elissa.
Thank you. I'm not sure I have much to add. Apologies. I think it's really about also appreciating the way in which the asymmetries in terms of how countries are integrated in global, you know, finance, production, trade kind of networks articulate and compromise their capacity to exercise the right to development, if you want, as a national project. And then how we understand that by holding on to a feminist, an ecological, a human rights type of lens. So I think the book, by coming at it through the angle of debt, allows us to expose quite a few of those dimensions, holding on to debt as that prism in the way in which these asymmetries translate locally. So yeah, I don't know if that's of any use, but that's my kind of concluding comment.
Thank you. Marina.
So my concluding bits, I think what this book did, and I think it's very, you know, an agenda going forward, and, you know, for research, for policymaking, is to look to the broader picture and how women is affected. I think that is a trend now in the international organizations to see, you know, women much more as, you know, policies as to compensate the impact, but I think we need to look, you know, if you do austerity, or if you prevent governments to invest what they should do, and then you come with a compensatory for women, it's not positive. The net outcome is not positive. So I think we need to get a step back and actually see the broader view that, you know, austerity and policies that prioritize debtors over, human rights and domestic citizens is not favorable. We need to have this bigger picture moving forward. So yeah, thank you.
Great, thanks. Juan Pablo.
Yeah, I don't remember whether it was Johanna or Elisa who mentioned the importance of awareness, public awareness on that issues, generally speaking, with the human rights, including feminist perspective. And this is crucial. I mean, as scholars, how we contribute to the public opinion on how to understand, how to frame complex causalities, complex links, how that affects our living conditions. And we are working in a project. Dani is part of it. We are about, and this might be important for you, Johanna, as you are part of the Inter-American Human Rights System. We are about publishing a book on debt and human rights in the Inter-American Human Rights System. And one of the points is we provide arguments, even jurisdictional arguments, on why both the court and the Commission on Human Rights should be dealing with debt issues, including a feminist perspective, how the Commission and the court should be working on thematic reports, on specific cases, on country missions, including developing arguments and showing findings as well on how rights, including gender dimension, works in the region. On why we are today discussing these issues in the context of initiative of Special Rapporteur, a mandate on the right to development. And I think that debates around the legal basis and also the legal nature of the right to development offers a suitable conceptual framework to think of, understand, and also discuss around the links between sovereign debt and women's human rights. Because the right to development has a collective dimension and places both obligations and rights of states and on also non-state actors, which is fundamental when we think of the complex challenges that debt poses to women, if we want to catch the political, the legal, and economic nuances of the issues at stake. Thank you.
Thank you.
Might I just add here? Sorry, Dani, I'm going to jump in and just add that, I think it's really important today because we're looking at, the resolution of crisis, and there's so many, as we move on and we're looking at, the climate crisis and the need to finance transitions, green transitions, energy transitions, and that all involves a significant amount of debt. It's going to have an impact on development. So I think the lens that is being offered through this, the tools in this collection, I think it's really important because it's not just about looking at how we deal with existing debt, but how do we then design policies to prevent indebtedness in the future? And I think that's quite critical as well to look at. I just want to also say, because obviously this is being recorded and it was going to be published, that we're going to keep the links, there are helpful links in the chat, and we're going to presumably retain them and we'll put them in the recording, sort of descriptor or something that comes with it. So people who are watching this not live, don't worry, the links will be there somewhere for you to click on.
Great. So firstly, I want to thank all the speakers for a really rich and thought-provoking discussion. Congratulate Juan Pablo and your co-editor who's not with us today on this initiative. It's really important that books like this, which are on incredibly complicated topics, which it can be really only be a step in a process. It's not the end point of any of these processes, but it's really important that we do this. And it's really important that it's linked to the right to development, because as I think many of us have said, we need a new way of thinking about how human life and human societies and productive activities should be organized. And this is the contribution to them. So I want to thank you. I also want to thank Paul very much for all the work you've done, not totally in the background because we can see you, but without silently at least. But thank you very much. You should end something like this on a happy note, but I have to be honest, the thought that's occurred to me is I always think whenever when you read about societies that have collapsed or tragedy, social catastrophes that happen, you always think, how could there have been people not seeing what was happening as they were going into that crisis? And we're going into such serious crises, and that at the very least, books like this are really important because at least they're telling everyone you should be thinking about these issues. And when the history is written afterwards, at least we'll be able to say, well, we were trying to warn people of how bad things could be and then to change it. And that's, hopefully we'll be doing more than that, but at least we can take comfort from that. So I want to end, I want to thank my co-chair, Celine, for working to put this together. This is a great beginning for the academic circle and development dialogues, and hopefully we can all meet again in another discussion in the not too distant future. And thanks everyone. Have a good afternoon or day.